That morning, Rosie's Corner, a small cafe tucked into the corner of 5th Street in Medford, Oregon, welcomed the gentle drizzle of early spring rain. The windows fogged up with condensation, and tiny droplets crawled slowly down the glass like the breath of an old memory. Inside, soft jazz played in the background, blending with the aroma of fresh roasted coffee and just-baked muffins. It was a peaceful morning, like hundreds before it in that little town. But no one inside the cafe could have known that they were about to witness something that would change the way they saw life and courage. Franklin Harris, 79 years old, a retired U.S. Air Force veteran, sat at his usual spot by the window. He always arrived early, around 7 a.m., ordered a black coffee with no sugar, and sat for nearly an hour simply staring out at the street, lost in thought. He was a slender man, wearing a worn brown coat and an old Air Force cap, a gift from a comrade lost in the Korean War. His eyes were deep and slightly clouded with age, but whenever he looked out the window, a quiet glow returned to them. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was a grief too old to speak. His hands trembled slightly as he stirred his coffee, not from the cold, but from the tremor that came with age. He would smile when people asked, saying, "It's just a reminder that I'm still alive." To the cafe staff, he was a kind old man, always polite, always ordering with a gentle voice, and never forgetting to leave a generous tip, often more than expected. No one knew he had once commanded a flight squadron in the Korean War. They had survived being shot down 3 times, or that he'd saved 6 men from a burning plane on a snow-covered ridge. He never talked about it. He didn't think his past mattered anymore. The last person who truly knew him, his wife, had passed away 10 years ago, after a funeral. He withdrew into his old house and only came out each morning to Rosie's Corner as a quiet way to remind himself that life still went on, even if slowly and silently. That morning, he followed the same routine. Same table by the window, same black coffee. But something was different. The staff later recalled that he moved more slowly than usual, and his breathing seemed heavy. One nearby customer noticed he had to sit twice on his way from the door to counter. But Mr. Harris said nothing. He smiled, nodded, paid in cash, and left his usual $2 tip. At exactly 7:38 a.m., just as he lifted his coffee cup, his hand slipped, the cup toppled, spilling hot coffee across the table and onto his sleeve. He flinched, let out a dry, broken sound, and then collapsed forward onto the table. A waitress screamed. A young woman cried out, "Does anyone know CPR? Call 911. Panic filled the once tranquil cafe. Chairs were pushed back. People froze in alarm. All eyes on Mr. Harris, lying motionless, face pale, lips turning blue. A middle-aged man was already on the phone with emergency services. A young woman sobbed as she held Mr. Harris's hand. But no one really knew what to do. Then, from a quiet corner of the cafe, a 12-year-old boy stood up, small-framed, brown-haired, wearing a blue hoodie. His name was Eli Thompson. He often came to the cafe with his mother on Saturday mornings, spending time drawing or reading while she worked on her laptop. That day, by chance, they arrived earlier than usual because she had a last-minute work call. Eli didn't say a word. He ran straight to Mr. Harris, knelt beside him, gently brushed the coffee-soaked sleeve aside, and leaned down to check for a pulse. His hands were shaking, but his eyes held a rare focus. One woman gasped, "What are you doing?" Eli replied calmly, "He's in cardiac arrest. I learned CPR in school." And he began chest compressions. Not too hard, but firm and steady. He counted aloud, 1, 2, 3, trying to keep his breath steady. Everyone around watched, stunned, as a skinny young boy fought to pull a man back from the edge of death. A cafe worker located the emergency aid device in a wall cabinet, but no one knew how to use it. Eli paused just long enough to read the instructions on the case, then carefully placed the electrodes on Mr. Harris's chest and followed the prompts. "Clear," he shouted. A jolt. Mr. Harris's body arched slightly, then fell still again. Eli resumed compressions immediately. The ambulance arrived 6 minutes later. EMTs took over and gently moved Eli aside. One of the paramedics turned to him and whispered, "You did good, kid. If it weren't for you, he wouldn't have made it." The cafe stood in silence. Slowly, someone began to clap, then others, and soon the entire room was applauding. But Eli just stood there, catching his breath, hands sticky with spilled coffee, eyes wide and uncertain. He didn't see himself as a hero. He had just done what he believed was right. As for Mr. Harris, he was rushed to the ICU in full cardiac arrest. No one could say for certain whether he would survive. But everyone remembered the image of a 12-year-old boy who didn't wait for someone else to act, who stepped forward when it mattered most. And that was only the beginning of a story that would soon touch the entire nation. The peaceful morning at Rosie's corner turned into chaos the moment Mr. Franklin Harris collapsed onto the table. The air, once filled with a rich aroma of coffee and quiet chatter, was suddenly saturated with panic. Chairs scraped the floor, gas erupted, and a waitress, trembling, dialed 911. "A man's down. We need an ambulance fast." Her voice was barely audible over the rising panic. No one knew what to do. Mr. Harris had slumped sideways in his chair, face pale, lips turning bluish-purple. Clear signs of cardiac arrest. His eyes were closed, his chest still. Not a breath, not a sound. Everything seemed to freeze. And then, through the stunned crowd, a small hand shot forward. It was Eli Thompson, just 12 years old, who ran to the fallen man without hesitation. He didn't look back. He didn't ask permission. He simply moved. Eli had attended a first aid training workshop at school just 2 months prior. There, he learned how to check for a pulse, listen for breathing, and perform chest compressions. Back then, it all seemed like distant theory. Pages in a textbook, drills on a plastic dummy. Never once did he imagine those lessons would mean the difference between life and death in a real cafe on a rainy Saturday morning. He knelt beside Mr. Harris, brushing aside the spilled coffee. His hoodie was damp, his hands sticky, but his focus was razor sharp. He leaned in, ear close to the chest. No breathing, no pulse. Eli swallowed hard and placed his hands on the center of Mr. Harris's chest. Around him, silence fell like a heavy blanket. A woman sobbed. A man folded his hands and prayed, "Dear God, please let him live." But no one moved to act. Only Eli did. He started the compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. His small hands pressed down with all the strength he had. Each compression was a plea for life, a shot in the dark against the stillness that clung to the old man's body. His arms shook, but he didn't stop. His forehead beaded with sweat, hair falling across his face, but his eyes remained locked on his mission. Someone brought out an AED device, the automated external defibrillator kept behind the counter for emergencies. A worker handed it to Eli, unsure what to do. "Can you?" she stammered. Eli nodded. He opened the device, tore off the pads, and placed them on Mr. Harris's chest just as he was taught. "Everyone back," he shouted. The cafe cleared a space around him. The machine spoke in its calm, robotic voice, analyzing heart rhythm. "Do not touch the patient." Then, shock advised, "Press the flashing button now." He pressed it. Mr. Harris's body jerked slightly. One last involuntary movement, then stillness again. But the AED beat steady and strong. Eli checked once more. Still no breathing. He resumed compressions. 1, 2, 3. Minutes passed. To those watching, it felt like an eternity. Then came the sirens. Red and blue lights reflected off the window panes as paramedics rushed through the door. One of them gently pulled Eli back, kneeling where he had been and checking the man's vitals. For a moment, everyone held their breath. "We've got a pulse," the medic said softly. The cafe exhaled in unison. "You did everything right, kid," the medic added, laying a hand on Eli's shoulder. "You saved him." They lifted Mr. Harris onto the stretcher and wheeled him out into the rain, where the ambulance waited. No one knew yet if he would make it, but everyone in that coffee shop would forever remember the image of the little boy with messy hair and coffee-stained sleeves, who didn't wait for an adult to fix things, who didn't freeze, who acted. As the ambulance pulled away, the crowd slowly began to applaud, not the thunderous kind meant for stadiums, but the heartfelt, trembling claps of people witnessing something bigger than themselves, something good, Eli stood silently, unsure what to do with his hands now. He looked smaller than ever, but in the eyes of every adult in that cafe, he stood 10 feet tall. From that day on, Rosie's Corner wasn't just a cozy cafe on Main Street. It was a place where a child stood between life and death and chose not to step aside. Franklin Harris survived. After 3 days in intensive care, his aged heart began to recover, almost like a miracle. The doctors called it a rare case at age 79. But what touched the hearts of Americans across the country wasn't just the fact that his heart began to beat again. It was everything that happened afterward. It was a bond between a 12-year-old boy and an old veteran who, at first glance, had nothing in common, yet were forever tied together by something more powerful than blood. The story spread quickly. Security footage from Rosie's Corner had captured the entire moment. A small brown-haired boy kneeling next to a collapsed man, performing CPR without hesitation. That video aired on dozens of news stations, from local channels to national evening shows. Headlines called him the boy who saved a veteran or a young hero in the rain. Editorials wrote that his actions were proof of compassion that could bridge generations. In Medford, that small rainy town, Rosie's Corner, the quiet cafe on the corner, suddenly became a pilgrimage site for those who wanted to visit the place where kindness triumphed over death. A sign now hung behind the counter. At this window seat, a life was given back by a young heart that knew how to care. 1 week later, once Mr. Harris regained consciousness and could speak again, Eli and his mother came to visit him in the hospital. There were no more machines, no more beeping heart monitors, only soft morning light streaming through the window. Eli stood awkwardly by the bed. Mr. Harris saw him and smiled faintly. He reached out his hand, one steady at the controls of a fighter jet, now trembled with age. The boy stepped forward and took his hand. No words were needed. It was a handshake of gratitude, of reverence, and of a bond so deep only moment of life and death could forge it. Mr. Harris exhaled slowly, then reached into the pocket of his hospital gown. He pulled out a worn velvet box. Inside was a weathered bronze medal, its engraved edges fading. For courage in service, U.S. Air Force. He looked at Eli, his voice soft. "You're a hero, kid, not just because you saved me, but because you acted while everyone else froze." Eli flushed and gave a shy smile. "I just did what I thought was right." Mr. Harris placed a medal in Eli's hands and nodded, like passing down a silent mission. And from that day on, the two, an old veteran who had survived war and a boy not yet old enough to drive, became the closest of friends. Every Saturday morning, Eli and his mom came back to Rosie's Corner. But now, instead of sitting with his mother, Eli sat across from Mr. Harris, at the same window-side table that had become a symbol. They drank together, black coffee for Mr. Harris, hot cocoa for Eli. Mr. Harris told stories of flying above the Korean peninsula, of cold nights in the trenches, of friends who never made it home. Eli listened closely, his eyes wide, picturing scenes he had only read about in history books. One morning, just as the sun peeked through the clouds, Mr. Harris said, "You know, I used to be a mischievous little rascal back in my day, but I was never as brave as you." Eli laughed. "I think everyone has courage. It just falls asleep sometimes." And just like that, 2 generations, separated by nearly 70 years, found common ground not through shared experiences, but through shared kindness. Kindness that needed no explanation. Courage that needed no uniform. Sometimes it came in the form of a boy with sticky sleeves and trembling hands, pressing down on an old man's chest while the world watched. That year, Eli was invited to Washington, D.C., to attend the Veterans Memorial Ceremony. He stood on the podium in a slightly oversized blue blazer, next to Mr. Harris, who leaned on a cane but stood tall with pride. Eli only said a few words. "I'm not a hero. I just believe that someone's life was worth doing something about. I think if more people believed that, the world might be a little safer." The audience rose to their feet in applause. And as they stepped down from the stage, Mr. Harris whispered, "I've been given medals before, but today I was given hope." They continued to meet at Rosie's Corner every weekend. Locals greeted them by name. A photo of the two hung behind the counter with the words, "Here, a boy and a veteran prove that kindness has no age." In a world where bad news often overshadows the good, where people forget how to smile at strangers, Eli and Mr. Harris's story stood as a quiet reminder that courage doesn't have to be loud, and that compassion sometimes begins in the hands of a 12-year-old boy with a heart big enough to carry another man's life. If you believe that kindness still exists in this world, subscribe to the Old Soldier channel to hear more touching stories like this. And don't forget to leave a comment to share your thoughts, because you too might be the next person to inspire others